The following program is partially funded by the Humanities Foundation of West Virginia, a state program of the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Oh, say, did you see him going early this morning? He passed by your door on his way to the coal. He was tall, he was slender, and his dark eyes so tender. His occupation was mining, West Virginia his home.
I worked a minute, 10 and 12 hours from daylight to dark for a quarter.
And the coal operators, they were always from a big city, you know, at least we felt like they were so far away. And then to come in and tell us what we could do, what to do, there was a resentment about it.
All the law was on the coal operator's side, even down to the governor and everything else was on their side, you know. They didn't sympathize much with the coal miners.
We wore mostly big coveralls. Get them to about 2 sizes bigger. I wore about a 44 then, so you could put your gun down your leg and struck it up your shoulder under your overhaul.
We wanted freedom. That's what we were fighting for, freedom.
Blair Mountain, West Virginia, an insignificant ripple in the vast wave of ridges and peaks that make up the great Appalachian mountain range. But to the people of this state, especially to those who remember, Blair Mountain is a lasting monument to a major historic event, one that affected the lives of thousands of West Virginians, and in time, the entire nation. For in 1921, more than 10,000 coal miners marched to the foot of this mountain to put an end to an unjust system that had taken their health, their homes, and their freedom. Before it was over, they faced machine guns, bombing assaults, and United States troops. This, the largest gathering of armed workers in the history of American labor, became known as the Battle of Blair Mountain. But the story of what happened here began much earlier, when the land was quiet and the population thin. This is the story of coal, the making of a union, and the collision of competing interests and dreams. The Industrial Revolution exploded onto the American scene in the mid-1800s. Factories and foundries, millers and mechanics, all required one source of fuel to run their machines and drive their manufacturing ambitions: coal.
Thomas Jefferson was writing about it in the 1800s. He was writing about the large deposits of coal in the western section of the state of Virginia, what would become the state of West Virginia. The trouble was the mountains, the Appalachian Mountains, prohibited any type of transportation network that was needed to get in and get the coal out. So it's not until the 1880s, when you have the development of the steam-driven plow that can tunnel through the mountains, that you have the large-scale commercial development of coal.
By 1880, geological surveys had established that West Virginia's coal was among the world's finest. It was high in quality, and the seams were thick. Realizing this, financiers and large corporations from outside the state, from New York, Boston, Philadelphia, even London, acquired large tracts of land and mineral rights in the state and leased those lands to coal operators on a royalty basis.
To mine West Virginia's vast resources and meet the increasing demands of industry, coal operators needed an awesome supply of labor. Because the state was sparsely populated, it was necessary to recruit workers from elsewhere. Blacks from the South and thousands of European immigrants newly arrived in America were enticed to the coal fields. From 1880 to the start of World War I, the population of West Virginia soared, and with it, the production of coal. To do their work, miners descended into the dark underground where they drilled, blasted, and dug at the walls of the mines. Boys worked beside their fathers, picking slate from the coal, baling water, or driving the mules that carried the coal to the surface.
It was hard work, no question about it, because you go in low coal, it was only about 3.5, 4 foot high. About 4 foot would be the highest.
You'd have to make you a cut with a pick then. You see, we didn't have no machines.
When I was 14 years old, I worked for a quarter a day and done as much as a man got.
I've done coal down here, 14 hours, hundreds and hundreds of days, and got 7 for it. Yeah. Church would be a breaking up when we quit dumping coal.
Oh, there'll be them signs and wonders.
Mining coal wasn't just hard work, it was dangerous work. Coal dust covered bodies and filled lungs, often sending miners to early graves. If black lung disease didn't claim them, there was the ever-present threat of collapsing tunnels or methane gas explosions. One mining accident could cause the deaths of hundreds of workers.
No safety rules, whatever. If a man got killed, well, they just hauled him out and buried him. That's about all of us to it back in them days.
Lord, I want to be ready when this world is to an end.
Many of West Virginia's coal mines were located in obscure, out-of-the-way places. Because of this, it was necessary for the coal operators to build settlements near the mines, with houses, a school, church, and general store. The company town was a ready-made community for the miner and his family.
You'd build the houses to be occupied by your employees. You'd build a store to furnish them the goods they need to live, because they couldn't get them anywhere else.
There was no roads out of a coal company, and they had to set up a way of getting merchandise and food to the miners within and around the area they worked. Company stores were set up in necessity.
They had everything you need, groceries, clothes, and furniture. And naturally, you just went there and got it, and they checked it through the office and took it off of what you made.
Houses were real close together. They were weatherboarded.
Some of them was plastered inside, and some of them it had wallpaper on them. There's cheap houses. It didn't have no water in them or nothing like that.
The working men had no houses that had any plumbing. Only the White House, and that was where the general manager lived.
In the early years, the miners and their families accepted their way of life in the company towns. It was a life full of hardships, but compared to what most had experienced before, it was a secure life, perhaps too secure. Remote and isolated, cut off from outside scrutiny and moderating influences, the company town became absolute in its power.
In many other coal fields around the country, one could start a coal camp near an established community. But in southern West Virginia, the geography and terrain made it necessary for the operator to develop the entire community. The problem was that even the best of these had the potential of enormous social control over the people who lived there. The company houses had vacate leases in them, which gave the operator complete control over the living conditions of the miner.
The coal companies built the school, they hired the school teachers. The teachers had more or less control of the school, could talk about anything they want except the union. You see it in the church. Since the coal companies built the church, they hired the minister. The minister served the company. He could not address the social wants and needs of the miners, such as talking about the need for higher wages. He could not talk about labor affairs.
The miners lived in company houses. Virtually everything was owned by the company. They were even paid with company scrip, which was a type of company money, little coins or bills that the company issued to the miners as their pay. It wasn't even American money, and this was redeemable in the company stores at inflated prices in the company stores.
The law enforcement officials were either controlled or influenced greatly by the company, so that what you had in those communities was almost a complete potential, at least, for almost complete control of the lives, both working lives and community lives of the coal miner.
Other injustices were less obvious. Miners made 30 cents a ton for the coal they dug, but their actual earnings could be substantially lower due to the practice of cribbing, shorting the miner on the weight of his coal.
At that time, they was loading 2,240 pounds for a ton. See, 2,000 was a ton, still now it is. But then the companies got that much off the men. Before you got a ton of coal, you had to load 2,240 pounds. That was over a ton.
Completely dependent upon the coal operators for their jobs and sustenance, the miners were afraid to speak out against the injustices in their lives. As years passed, resentment festered, discontentment grew. Faint whispers of strike and solidarity began to filter through the narrow mountain passes.
Don't scab for the bosses, don't listen to their lies. Us poor folks just ain't got a chance unless we organize.
The cause of unionism had barely begun when coal operators established their company towns. Yet the skyrocketing demand for coal and the miners' condition prompted the rapid rise of numerous unions throughout the coal-producing states. A national convention was held in 1890, and the United Mine Workers of America was born.
The basic purpose of the United Mine Workers was to represent the miners as an organization in such a way as to improve their pay, their working conditions, their social conditions, to improve their safety. Mining was the most dangerous occupation in America. West Virginia lost as many coal miners each year in accidents as the nation lost in its last war before 1912, that having been the Spanish-American War. More than that, the miners in West Virginia especially, saw in the United Mine Workers Union a way out of this sense of helplessness that they felt so strongly.
The UMW scored its first major victory in 1898 when it established the Central Competitive Field, made up of the coal fields in Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois. There it won a guaranteed 8-hour day and negotiated pay increases. Now it turned its attention to West Virginia.
The unionization of the coal mines of West Virginia was important as a point of demarcation in organizing the coal fields throughout the Appalachians, and in fact the unionization of the South. Coal miners were organized elsewhere in the country, in Pennsylvania and in the Midwest, and yet the very large and rich coal fields of the Appalachian were not. As long as these miners continued on an unorganized basis, it provided a threat to all of the coal miners elsewhere in the country. In fact, without the unionization of the Appalachians, there really could hardly be a miners' union.
Certainly, organizing West Virginia in those days was difficult from the very beginning. In the first place, a lot of the native or Appalachian miners did not understand much about the concept of unionism and had to be educated to its benefits. At the same time, we see a situation where coal operators saw in the spread of the United Mine Workers a increase in radicalism, and a competing economic system such as socialism or perhaps later even communism. For other operators, particularly small coal operators, they felt an economic pinch very dramatically by this spread. Many of them had leases which they had to pay royalties on whether they produced coal or not, and they felt that this equalization of wages, which was a major goal of the United Mine Workers, squeezed them and cut their profit margin to nil.
And the operators felt that the United Mine Workers really intended to come in and not simply improve the standards of life of the coal miners, but to take over the coal mines, to take over the property of the coal operators, and to operate the mines themselves. And they fought this bitterly.
Perhaps the greatest obstacle to union organizing in West Virginia was the geography itself, particularly in the southern half of the state where steep, rugged mountains served as barriers between counties and towns. About the only way to move in and out of the coal fields here was the way the coal moved, by rail. Coal operators hired guards from the Baldwin Felts Detective Agency of Bluefield, West Virginia, to police trains and depots and to turn back any suspected organizers. By 1912, the United Mine Workers managed to become the largest union in the nation, boasting a membership of more than 250,000. But in West Virginia, its ranks remained small. Although it gained footholds in certain counties, its influence was limited, and its hopes for winning the state were wearing thin. Then, in the spring of that same year, their movement took on a new dimension. Paint Creek and Cabin Creek, two small streams that flow into the Kanawha River about 12 miles east of Charleston, the state's capital. Most of the mines in this area, except for those along Cabin Creek, had been unionized by 1912. The total population of both areas, including miners and their families, approached 35,000. Living conditions, according to a later Senate investigative subcommittee, were shocking. This was the setting for what would become a violent 20-year struggle.
The contract between the United Mine Workers and the coal operators of Paint Creek expired in April of 1912, and efforts to renegotiate a contract failed. When that happened, the miners went out on strike, and the coal operators began making plans to operate without them.
The Paint Creek strike spread quickly to nearby Cabin Creek, where all but a few of the coal mines at the mouth of the hollow operated on a non-union basis. The coal miners on Cabin Creek demanded several things of the operators. First of all, of course, they wanted union recognition. Secondly, they wanted the right to make sure that they got fair treatment in terms of the payment of coal. So they demanded a check weighman who would check the company's weight of the coal and give them a fair shake. They also demanded the right of free assembly so that they could have speeches, they could work politically and economically to prove their own interests. They also wanted the right to be able to trade at any store in the area without any punishment. They also wanted the right to have a 9-hour day, and they wanted the safety laws of the state enforced.
When the miners of Paint Creek and Cabin Creek combined forces, that meant there were more than 15,000 miners on strike in central West Virginia. The coal operators, too, joined forces in an association which now looked upon the strike as of far greater importance, far more critical to the total future of the coal industry in southern West Virginia, in the state and in the southern Appalachians.
Reacting harshly and without hesitation, the coal operators brought in more Baldwin Felts agents. The number along both creeks rose to more than 300. Their job was to evict all striking miners and their families from company houses and lands. Guards swept through houses, tossing out miners' clothing and furniture. Others, with high-powered rifles, rounded up the strikers and their wives and children and removed them from company property. Shocked and homeless, the miners and their families had to find shelter wherever they could, in caves, tents, and improvised shacks. The union brought in food and additional tents, and in time, Scores of tent colonies sprang up in the mountain hollows.
The coal operators felt totally justified in their actions, as bad as those actions seem to us today. The law was on their side. They had leases, they had contracts. The evictions took place after the miners were given notices to move. The coal operators offered to move their furniture where they wished. They offered them jobs in union mines elsewhere. They felt they had to have those houses in order to bring in new workers to keep the mines operating, which to them was the primary consideration. The trouble is they just went too far. The Baldwin Felts detectives continuously harassed and intimidated the miners even after they had gone on strike, had left their company homes, and lived in tents in the community. They were hired professional strikebreakers, and that's what they'd come in to do.
This company thugs, what you was. You couldn't go along the road without to stop and search you.
If three men got together, the big boss would tell them, y'all better break it up.
They was murderers. That's all it was. They kicked the people out of their houses.
Meanwhile, the coal bosses began to fortify themselves against possible retaliations. Barricades and concrete bunkers were built. Machine guns were purchased and placed in strategic locations. Floodlights searched the hillsides and main gates at night. Anxious to resume operations, the coal bosses posted ads in eastern cities for new workers. These they planned to transport in on specially guarded trains.
The operators felt they had to resort to stronger methods because this thing had taken on a scale the like of which they hadn't seen before. And for that reason, they used armored trains, a great deal, many more mine guards, scabs, and whatever supplies, etc., were necessary to checkmate the miners' organization.
Outraged by the actions of the coal operators, union organizers, including the legendary Mother Jones, came to Paint and Cabin Creeks to rally the miners. More importantly, local leaders such as Bill Blizzard and Frank Keeney emerged from the ranks of the strikers. Miners themselves, they had had their fill of fear and intimidation. They were ready to fight back.
For decades, they had been cowed. The coal companies, and particularly Baldwin Felts mine guards, used terror to kind of intimidate the miners, terrorize them into submission. During this strike, when they encountered terrorism or the violence on a day-to-day basis, the miners themselves began to turn the table, turn the trick, you might say. They began to employ violence against the mine guards.
They bought guns for $1, $2, $3 a piece, frequently using union relief funds, and they took to the hills, and they were determined they were either going to drive these guards out or kill them.
Union miners north of Paint Cabin Creeks, hearing about the fighting, knowing that a victory by the coal operators would jeopardize their own gains, took up arms and marched to the aid of their fellow miners. Within 24 hours, 6,000 had gathered at the headwaters of Cabin Creek, spoiling for a fight. Coal operators handed out guns to anyone on their side who could shoot. More barricades were built. More machine guns put in place. Both sides were primed and ready. Then, the governor stepped in.
The Paint Creek Cabin Creek strike would set the pattern for the role of government in all succeeding strikes in West Virginia, at least coal strikes in West Virginia, until the New Deal of the 1930s. That would be the government, state government would try and stay out of the strike as long as it could, or as long as the coal companies were in control of the strike. With that strike, Paint Creek Cabin Creek strike, once the coal miners had turned the tide, that is, once the miners had started to gain control of the strike, or were on the verge of victory, the state government jumps in. You see the state governor declaring martial law and calling out the state troops to break the strike.
A military tribunal was set up, martial law was imposed, and arrests were made. And although some Baldwin Felts guards were indeed arrested and tried, most of the arrests involved striking miners. Then the coal operators began to bring in transportations, or scabs, workers from New York and Ohio and places like that. And when they came in, the militia protected them. This outraged the strikers, because here again they saw this was the end of it all. They would lose everything once those scabs came in and took their homes and their jobs.
During the bitter West Virginia winter, Paint and Cabin Creeks quieted. The strikers, still living in tents and shacks, faced other hardships. Many were near starvation. Children died from the cold.
It was awfully cold. People had to have a double top put on their tents in order to help to hold the snow off, keep them breaking down these tents. It was cold weather during that time. You had to wrap up awfully good.
In February of 1913, violence again flared. This time, an armored train, one used for transporting scab labor to the mining camps, was commandeered for a special night journey. With a coal operator, sheriff, and mine guards on board, the Bull Moose Special, as it was called, drove with its lights out through the valley of Holly Grove. As it approached a colony of strikers camped near the tracks, the mine guards opened fire.
Miraculously, only one person was killed. Cisco Eastap was killed. And dozens were wounded. It's a miracle only one person was killed. They got to the end of the line. The co-operator on the train, Quinn Morton, hollered, "Back it up, we'll give the sons of bitches another round." This one of the times Baldwin Felt's mine guards showed a little humanity and would not let him do it.
Shortly after the incident at Holly Grove, newly elected Governor Henry D. Hatfield ordered union leaders and coal operators to reach an agreement. When they failed to do so, Hatfield dictated his own terms and forced the strike to an end. Reluctantly, both sides made concessions, which only left them more embittered. The coal operators rededicated themselves to stopping the Union, and they made it plain. If the Union was to come to southern West Virginia, it was going to have to come inch by bloody inch. But the Paint and Cabin Creek strike demonstrated what the miners were willing to endure for the Union. They had gotten a glimpse of what solidarity could win. The mine wars of West Virginia were momentarily interrupted by the Great War. Coal was now vital for national survival. Thousands of West Virginia miners saw active duty. Those who stayed to work the mines were given an increase in wages in return for a promise not to strike for the duration of the war. At war's end, while the rest of America celebrated, many West Virginians returned home to old conflicts. Miners' wages lagged far behind wartime inflation. More aggravating, profits had increased during the war and coal operator earnings had more than doubled. Frustrated by these post-war conditions, the acting president of the United Mine Workers, John L. Lewis, called for a national strike in November 1919.
The 1919 strike was the first time West Virginia miners had really participated in a national coal strike. This was a strike called by Lewis, of course, to get wage increases for the coal miners to match the inflation rates during the time. For several reasons, Lewis and President Woodrow Wilson compromised that strike. Basically, the nation was out of coal. They needed the coal. So Lewis realized that need. He's willing to compromise the strike, and part of the compromise included a small wage increase for the miners, but also recognition of the Union.
But in southern West Virginia, in Mingo, McDowell, and southern Logan counties, as well as in Pike County, Kentucky, the strike had never existed. This was an unorganized field, and the miners did not receive the benefit of that strike. This pointed out 2 points to each side. Lewis and the Union saw that they could never be completely successful in a national strike until they had brought the Southern Appalachians into the Union. The miners of southern West Virginia saw that they, by striking, could achieve some of the benefits that the nation's miners had received that winter. This, of course, brought about discussions for organizing the southern Appalachian coal fields, and they zeroed in on the Tug River field of southern West Virginia along the Kentucky border.
Frank Keeney, now president of District 17, was responsible for all Union activity in southern West Virginia. From his headquarters in Charleston, he dispatched organizers into the non-Union counties of Logan and Mingo. Said Keeney, "If our organizers come back in pine boxes, neither heaven nor hell will stop the miners."
Rumors and some true stories reached Keeney in Charleston about the brutal treatment which was visited upon organizers of the Union and, in fact, upon miners who joined the Union. It was certainly true that organizers in southern West Virginia were frequently beaten, jailed, and run out of the area forcefully. The rumors went far beyond that. There were stories that the miners who joined the Union were beaten and murdered. Their wives and children were beaten and murdered, and their bodies stacked up on street corners. These stories spread throughout West Virginia and aroused the miners to such fury that in September, Keeney mobilized 3,000 of them along Lenz Creek near Charleston to begin a march across southern West Virginia to correct this situation.
To march into Mingo would have meant going over the top of Blair Mountain. It also meant that the miners would have to pass through Logan County, a notoriously anti-Union stronghold. Controlled by its powerful Sheriff Don Chafin, the county had been a block to Union organizing in southern West Virginia for years. Everyone knew that the fight for Mingo would have to start in Logan.
I was always scared to go to Logan County. It was just, it was frightful to think that they were under that, they couldn't unionize or they couldn't do what they wanted to.
Don Chafin was ramrod of Logan County in them days. And when Don Chafin spoke, why, everybody rised, you know. They believed him in him as a lord or something. And he wasn't going to have the Union in Logan County.
Desperate to avert catastrophe, the current governor, John J. Cornwell, promised that he would personally investigate the alleged murders in Logan and Mingo. So the miners turned back, waiting to see what would become of the governor's promise. But they made it clear it wouldn't take much to make them march again. One of the richest coal-producing areas in southern West Virginia was located in Mingo and McDowell counties near the Kentucky border.
The Union began active organizing efforts by sending professional organizers into the Tug River area. The operators along the Tug were as hostile and as opposed to the idea of unionization as anyone in the country, even more so than those along Paint Creek and Cabin Creek.
In the spring of 1920, Frank Keeney called for a strike of all the miners in the region. Once again, coal operators locked out Union miners and Baldwin Felt's agents were brought in to carry out eviction orders. Their task complete, the gunmen went into nearby Matewan village to wait for a train that would take them back to their Bluefield headquarters. Matewan's chief of police, Sid Hatfield, along with the mayor and a few striking miners, walked to the depot and challenged the agent's authority. Tempers flared and a gunfight broke out. But it all looked pre-planned. Shots were fired from rooftops and from second-story windows. When the smoke cleared, 10 men were dead at the Matewan depot. 7 of them were Baldwin Felt's agents, including Albert and Lee Felts, brothers of Thomas Felts, the agency's owner. The mayor and 2 striking miners were also killed. Events at Matewan gained national attention, and Sid Hatfield emerged from the controversy as a popular hero of the miners. The Matewan massacre lent passion to the Union cause, and within weeks, 90% of the miners in Mingo County had taken the Union oath.
The Matewan massacre gave the strikers something to rally around. This time they took the offensive. They became more militant and determined to win the strike. A form of guerrilla warfare broke out that summer and continued in the fall and winter of 1920 and 21. In January of 1921, Sid and Ed Chambers and other miners who were involved in the Matewan massacre were tried for the murder of the Baldwin Phelps detectives in their home county of Mingo, and the jury acquitted all of them on the grounds, I believe, they felt the Baldwin Phelps detectives had it coming to them.
After his inauguration in 1921, the new governor, Ephraim Morgan, sent state police into the strike zone. Unable to contain the violence there, Morgan declared martial law and dispatched additional militia and law enforcement personnel to Mingo County. But the miners this time weren't going to allow state authorities to break the strike. Despite martial law and the presence of militia, the turmoil continued. Then, on August 1st, 1921, a single bloody episode unleashed one of American labor's greatest conflicts. Sid Hatfield and Ed Chambers, both cleared in the Matewan massacre trial, were called to the McDowell County Courthouse to face charges on a similar shooting. As they and their wives walked up the courthouse steps, 3 Baldwin Phelps gunmen emptied their revolvers into Hatfield and Chambers.
I looked up and there was 3 men at the head of the steps. And so I immediately pulled the door to and just ran right up there because, like a boy, I wanted to see what was going on and what was happening. So I went up and said, and one fellow had fallen down the steps into the what they call a pit where you turn in off of Wyoming Street up the steps. And the first landing there was a man dead there and a woman leaning over him crying. And she was down on her knees and crying and holding him in her arms and kissing him and saying, "Oh, my love," says, "they've killed you, cold-blooded," and says, "they've killed you," says, "they promised to protect you up here to this day in trial."
It was a very sad time for the whole area. And I guess at the way I recall, because I was at the funeral, and I think that was the largest funeral that I had ever been a part of. They were buried right across from Matewan at Buskirk. And I'm sure that entire mountain was all but covered with miners for the most part, you see. The lawyer, I guess the union lawyer from Charleston who gave the eulogy, the sentences always stayed with me and it was raining. Not a hot downpour, but a steady patter. And I can remember him making the statement, "Is it a wonder that even the heavens weep?"
The murders of Hatfield and Chambers marked a tragic turning point in the miners' struggle. Their only hero murdered. They felt the futility of their cause. The winters waiting for recognition, the long years without hope. Six days after the murders of Hatfield and Chambers, Frank Keeney called for a rally of miners at the state capitol. The size of the turnout was a surprise.
Approximately 4,000 to 6,000, 7,000 miners meet there with him. He listens to speeches by Mother Jones, by Frank Keeney. Keeney goes in to ask the governor to protect the union organizers he's sending into Logan and Mingo counties. In other words, just give us our rights. When the governor refused to meet with him, that's when Keeney comes out before the miners, tells them, "You have no rights in this state, therefore you have no recourse except to fight." He tells them go home to wait the call to mobilize.
The call couldn't have come soon enough for the coal miners, and their intentions were clear. They wanted to free the strikebreakers and union organizers in Logan and Mingo County jails. They wanted to break Don Chafin's control over Logan County. They wished to take on the state police and end martial law in Mingo County, and of course, they wanted to organize all the miners in both Mingo and Logan counties.
Keeney's call for mobilization came on August 21st, 1921, and within 72 hours, an estimated 7,000 armed miners had assembled near Marmette, 10 miles outside of Charleston.
We went to Lynn Creek, and we stayed a day or two there, I think. And then Mother Jones come. I don't know how she come there now, but she made a speech, and she told the miners to go home.
Mother Jones did speak to the miners, tell them not to go on the march, wave a piece of paper in the air saying it was a telegram from President Harding saying he would take action in their favor. Keeney and Mooney and my father told the miners that the telegram was a fake. I asked Keeney, I knew Keeney, by the way, in later years, and I asked him point blank if there had been actually a telegram. I didn't get a very straight answer. I didn't press it. I rather think, this is my own opinion, I rather think the telegram was genuine. But in any case, the miners believed that it was not. And whatever they believed, they did go on the march without question.
On August 24th, the Army began the 70-mile march to Logantown, its first objective.
The miners who took part in the March on Logan were a fully trained, highly disciplined Army. Frank Keeney was the unofficial leader of the March on Logan. They had a journalism oath. Bill Bliss, they brought in one veterans who trained the miners. They taught them troop movements. They taught them flank formations or flank movements. They formed squadrons. They also developed a way to dress to recognize their own soldiers. There'd be a red bandana around the neck and jeans.
As the miners made their way from town to town, their ranks swelled. To the people along the way, it was an unforgettable sight.
A lot of people wake up at morning and their porch would be full of miners laying there sleeping where they's on the march. And my mother and my two eldest sisters, they cooked and prepared food, and my daddy carried it to the miners.
Some of them had on their service uniforms, OD uniforms. And most of them had on coveralls, and they had a red bandana handkerchief around their neck. I remember that. And for that reason, they called them rednecks.
I can remember this particular family, the large man, his wife, the large family, running, all but running. And I remember the expression was, there's a blue million of them coming from Blair Mountain.
Old men, young men, and middle-aged men, men with automatic, the latest rifles that you could buy, and men with old muzzle loaders.
I don't know, there was thousands from around here, but they was coming in from Illinois, Pennsylvania, and Ohio, the miners was. And they told the government if they didn't open up Logan County that they was going to open it up themselves. Just blow it away.
Every little river must go down to the sea. All the slaving miners in our union will be free. Gonna march to Blair Mountain, gonna whoop the company, and I don't want you to weep after me.
Back in Charleston, state officials knew they had lost control of the situation. Governor Morgan wired President Harding, urging him to send federal troops to suppress the rebellion. Harding issued a statement ordering the miners to stop and sent World War I hero General H.H. Van Holtz to the scene. Van Holtz and Governor Morgan then called in Frank Keeney and gave him an ultimatum. Either the miners stop their march or they'd face federal troops. If that happened, Keeney and other Union leaders would be tried for treason.
The following day, Keeney and Fred Mooney, also of the Union leadership, set out to overtake the miners' army in the little town of Madison, in way between Charleston and there. Keeney and Mooney assembled the leadership of the miners' army in a baseball park, and Keeney made his famous speech to the miners' army. He told them that now they were no longer fighting just the governor of West Virginia or the sheriff of Mingo or Logan counties. They were fighting Uncle Sam himself, the United States Army, and President Harding. They had to turn back, he said. It was for their own safety, for the future of the Union. In fact, the entire Union could be in serious jeopardy if they didn't turn back. The miners listened quietly, gradually they began to accept this advice. That afternoon, somewhat reluctantly, they turned around and headed home.
But late that night, 70 state police and about 200 of Sheriff Don Chafin's deputies raided a coal camp at Sharpless on the Union side of Blair Mountain. They were surprised to find armed marchers still there, and a fierce gunfight broke out. Before the police and deputies retreated back into Logan County, they had killed and wounded several miners. Reports of the raid spread rapidly among the miners. By the following morning, they were back on the march. Logan prepared for invasion. Only 2 railway lines went into Logan County, and Don Chafin's guards controlled them. There were no roads. There was no direct way in except for 3 steep trails that went over Blair Mountain. Chafin and the miners knew that this was where they'd have to face each other. Chafin lined the crest of the mountain with 3,000 deputy sheriffs, Baldwin Felt's guards, and West Virginia State Police, armed with machine guns, submachine guns, and tear gas bombs. By August 28, the first wave of miners reached the foot of Blair Mountain.
When they hit Blair Mountain, they didn't just charge the mountain. They waited till everybody got there. Then bugle calls were given for certain squadrons to move at certain times. Previous to this, scouts had been sent out to cut down the telegraph and telephone wires. The local at Blair Mountain had dug trenches and provided other forms of shelter for the miners who were marching from Charleston. For once they got there, it was a highly organized, disciplined affair.
The shooting started on Tuesday morning, August 30th. An advance patrol of miners encountered a small outpost of Logan deputies. Several were killed in the skirmish and many others taken prisoner. Correspondents at the scene rushed the news to their papers. The Charleston Gazette, the New York Times, and the Washington Star blazed with sensational headlines. The nation was finally awakened to the events at Blair. Throughout the night and following day, fighting was heavy along several fronts. The sound of machine guns and sniper fire pierced the mountain air.
Talking about shooting, you couldn't hear your ears for the bullets. Couldn't hear nothing else, only shooting. It was just like bumblebees or honeybees are flying in the air. And that's about how it went.
We stayed pretty close during all that time. We never knew when the shooting was going to start or stop. And everybody had that had a basement. Certainly, they got a lot of use during this time.
They had about 2,000 or 3,000 men on top of the hill, entrenched in, with machine guns all along the top of the hill. And that my cousin had told me that they wasn't going to let anybody pass at all. They're going to kill every fellow that attempted to cross that mountain.
Private planes, paid for by the coal operators, were all
2 bombs on the marchers. One was a non-explosive, nauseating type. The other was a high explosive.
Reports of the battle at Blair Mountain poured into Charleston. Governor Morgan again appealed to President Harding for military aid. He was convinced that nothing except the show of federal troops could stop the miners now. President Harding responded with a public proclamation. He put 2 United States Army regiments on alert and sent General Bandholtz back to the battlefront. He then threatened to place the entire state of West Virginia under martial law unless the miners called off their attack by noon the next day. Ignoring the president's warning, the miners continued their assault. This time, they were going all the way.
By Thursday, September 1st, the miners believed that they could indeed go all the way. They had 10,000 men, 3 times the number that Chafin had on his defensive line, and they thought they could storm up Blair Mountain, through Logan, perhaps all the way to Mingo County. They were in control of some 500 square miles of southern West Virginia. They operated the trains. They controlled the school buildings. They confiscated automobiles. They were in command. They were not about to turn back as they'd done before. They were willing to put the test to President Harding's ultimatum.
That evening, from his field headquarters in Charleston, General Bandholtz wired Washington, requesting the immediate mobilization of United States troops. Within hours, Army battalions from Ohio, Kentucky, Indiana, and New Jersey were deployed to the Charleston area. On Saturday morning, September 3rd, 2,500 soldiers converged onto Blair Mountain. Half of the force moved in from behind the miners. The other half came in from the Logan side, behind the defenders.
Big Lewis White was a Union leader. He came and got up on a big wooden coal house we had and said, go in the mountains and tell the miners to ground arms and come out. That United States soldiers are coming up Coal River and Guyan River, and they'll do the right thing about it.
Both sides were ordered to cease fire, and both sides readily complied. The nation's largest armed insurrection since the Civil War was over.
It's hard to comprehend, of course, why with so much hatred on both sides the surrender occurred so easily. My explanation, at least one explanation, is that the arrival of the federal troops meant to West Virginia's miners that at long last they had gotten the attention of the country. Newsreels were sending in their first cameramen to record the event. Photographers were there, and for weeks thereafter, magazines and other newspapers investigated the plight of the West Virginia miner. After the surrender, the miners were taken in a train of trolley cars that were hitched together down Coal River, across the Canal River, into Charleston, right down the main street of Charleston. The townspeople turned out to see them as they came through. The miners were leaning out of the windows of the streetcars, yelling and cheering, and the people along the street, too, were cheering. And the miners, some of them, were waving American flags out of the windows. And they were yelling things like, "It was Uncle Sam did it." That was their victory. They had forced Uncle Sam, they had forced their country to come to their rescue, to come to their help.
While the Battle of Blair Mountain closed one turbulent chapter in West Virginia history, it was not the end of the coal miners' struggle. The following year, Frank Keeney and Bill Blizzard, along with over 500 other Union leaders and sympathizers, were indicted on charges of treason against the state for their role in the armed march. While most were acquitted or given light sentences, the court costs broke the district locals, forcing them to turn over control to the international organization. Between 1920 and 25, more than 50,000 men, women, and children were locked out of their jobs and evicted from company-owned houses and lands. Broken and disillusioned, their great moment of solidarity behind them, many miners went back to work in non-union mines. Only slowly did sympathy shift. It would be a decade before the miners and the union would see the fruits of their local struggle. Public opinion was changing, and the Roosevelt administration backed the rights of labor to organize. After more than 30 years, the Union had come to West Virginia. Blair Mountain is quiet today. What happened here in 1921 needs to be remembered, for it was a turning point for America. It was one of those rare moments when history itself seemed to hold its breath. Those at the top of the mountain were not just defending Logan and Mingo counties. They were defending the 19th century belief that those with wealth and power had a right to the destiny of those who toiled. Those who marched to the mountain were bringing with them the new century's conviction that there were limits to what humans could do to one another for the sake of profit and power. The mountain's shame is that it became a symbol for the violence of an era. Its glory is that so many came to insist that the new age begin.
While I'm on my journey, don't you weep after me. While I'm on my journey, don't you weep after me. And keep the soup beans boiling, 'cause I'm coming home, you'll see. And I don't want you to weep after me. Every little river must go down to the sea. All the slaving miners in our union will be free. Gonna march to Blair Mountain, gonna whoop the company. And I don't want you to weep after me. So while I'm on my journey, don't you weep after me. While I'm on my journey, don't you weep after me. And keep the soup beans boiling, 'cause I'm coming home, you'll see. And I don't want you to weep after me. No, I don't want you to weep after me.
The preceding program was partially funded by the Humanities Foundation of West Virginia, a state program of the National Endowment for the Humanities.